Thank you very much, and thank you for reminding me of my downward trajectory from being a junior lecturer at UCT in philosophy. And it has been in many ways. So it's wonderful, and thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak. This will be slightly different from the first marvelous input by Miranda, because when you were asked the question about the traffic lights and robots, so-called robots in South Africa, my inclination to answer is they don't actually work in South Africa, so you should ignore the question or at least respond. But anyhow, so yeah, my topic is the bigger the cake, puzzling over equality in post-apartheid South Africa. And the puzzle, of course, for us South Africans, not least those of us in politics itself, is that our April 1994 democratic breakthrough was expected to be a significant bridgehead to building, amongst other things, a much more egalitarian society. And this has not been the case. As Sakela Buhlungu said in opening this conference, you just have to travel from the South African, from Cape Town International Airport to this campus to get a sense of the huge prevailing inequalities in our society. Why? Well, predictably, there are many answers to that, and what I want to focus on this evening, this afternoon, is to try and remember what it was like to be a philosophy lecturer a long time ago, and to think about the ways in which we've tried to conceptualize as South Africans our approach to transforming South Africa, not least to try and bring about greater equality in our society. And I think that the conceptualization, maybe to borrow from and then adjust from Miranda, I think there's been a significant epistemic or hermeneutic capture of the way in which we try to think about these challenges that we've got. And what I want to then is to look at equality and the aspiration for greater equality or social equality in our society, and how it's been linked discursively and very problematically with a whole range of other core terms, concepts like liberty, like redistribution, like developed, and particularly developing and developed, the notion of growth, democracy itself, and then concluding with social compacting. So just briefly to indicate, and bearing in mind what was said right at the beginning, yes, when we talk about social equality, we're not talking about goodies, although I would want to insist that the goodies themselves, as one philosopher said, are congealed social relations themselves. So there's a social dimension in that reality. But also then at a more pragmatic level in South Africa to say, well, what I'm giving here is basically income inequality. It's easy to get those figures. But in South Africa in particular, where there's a huge dependence on a commodified market, in which independent, sustainable livelihoods, compared to the rest of Africa or many other third world countries, where there's a peasantry, for instance, which is to some extent outside of the market and therefore outside of money incomes. Here in South Africa, the great majority of people are dependent on incomes, and therefore income inequalities are a good indicator, I think, of a whole range of other inequalities. So here they are. So disappointingly, the Gini coefficient, I'm sure most of you will know, or all of you will know, that Gini coefficient measures income inequality. 0 is a completely equal society in income terms, and 1 is where one individual appropriates all of the income in the society, so an incredibly unequal society. So the closer you get to 1 in this metric, the further you are away from income equality. And so in 1995, so immediately after the democratic breakthrough and the abolition, at least at a juridical and legal level, of the apartheid regime, our Gini coefficient was 0.64. It actually got worse over the following 10 years, 0.69. It ameliorated somewhat to 6.75, but never going below the 6.74. And possibly, I haven't got the most recent figure, possibly it's got a bit worse again. And then some other figures. The richest 10% of households in South Africa take in over half of the national income. The poorest 40% of households receive 5.6% of national income. And these inequalities, these income inequalities, are sharply marked, as you would expect, by race, but by gender as well as by space. I haven't got the spatial dimensions, but there you see median income of a white household, 20,000, median income of an African household, 3,000. Median earning of a white male is some 6 times more than an African female. Okay, so just rough indicators of gross inequality, which is apparent in any case at the most superficial level if one travels around South Africa. Now, what I want to do is really alight on a couple of texts or speeches, discursive interventions into the space of grappling with and puzzling about inequality in South Africa and the challenges that we're facing. And I want to begin then with the official, at that stage, 1994, published a few weeks after the dramatic elections, which you see over here on the right, where millions of South Africans queued up patiently for hours and hours to exercise that equal right of one person, one vote, a kind of foundational moment and breakthrough moment in democratization in South Africa. Now, interestingly, the official journal of the ANC, of which I'm a member, so when let me, you know that, but let me confess that. Let me remind myself that I am. The official journal of the ANC chose to celebrate the event, the breakthrough, democratic breakthrough, with that cover, which, sorry, it's a bit scrappy because it's taken off a photocopy. I don't have the original any longer, but basically it's the inauguration of President Nelson Mandela at the Union Buildings, the old offices of the old White House of the apartheid regime, but the new presidential offices of the incoming new regime as well. A fly past of jets on the occasion of the inauguration, not asking too many questions. Who are the pilots and what were they doing in Angola and Namibia a few years previously, but okay. And the slogan, "Free at last." Okay. And then inside, the editorial runs something like this. Well, it runs like this, and I'm quoting directly from it. "The moment has arrived. Liberation, real change, national democratic revolution, call it what you may." I note immediately that the editorialist is not quite sure what to call it. And this is, by the way, an early symptom of a problem that I want to trace as we move along. It's the moment that flashed through the minds of many a hero as they succumbed to the assassin's bullet, the hangman's noose, the torturer's fatal blow from the forebearers, their embrace of colonial settlers only to be betrayed many centuries ago, etc., through to mass action in the 1970s and 80s and early 90s, armed struggle, underground work, third force violence directed against the liberation movement, and at the apex, the attempted sabotage of the electoral process. So we can see here a massive and understandable and not entirely illegitimate and not entirely inaccurate attempt to invest this moment. Is it the voting moment, or 2 weeks later, the inauguration moment? So hold on to that thought. But also the incoming ANC-led administration with the legitimacy and mantle of centuries and decades of heroic struggle. Okay. Then it does, the very next passage, does a dramatic U-turn and symptomatic U-turn. Yet it says, "We dare not forget in the din of the cry of success," as if the editorials and the cover perhaps are not contributing a little bit to the din. "The march has been long and difficult, but we have only reached a milestone. The real battle beyond pomp and ceremony and the symbolism of new flag and anthem has just begun." So the previous passage has celebrated the moment, real change, and then it's basically it's in denial of those claims, effective denial. We're now merely at the beginning. It's not the end point of centuries of heroic struggle. And it's even suggesting that all that's happened and all that it's celebrating in the moment is little more than a din, pomp and ceremony, symbolism, a new flag and anthem. Okay. And I go on. Now ordinary people will rejoice only at the sight. So ordinary people are reduced from strugglers to viewers, spectators in a spectacle of jets going overhead or further spectacles to come, of the first 1 million houses that will be built according to the electoral promises. And then it says, let's remind ourselves of the words of a writer on the French Revolution, this Tocqueville, and it quotes Tocqueville, "Patiently endured so long as it seemed beyond redress, a grievance comes to appear intolerable once the possibility of removing it crosses men's minds." Unquote. And it goes on, "In June, allocations from the budget will be decided upon. A modest beginning can then be made." So we move from real change to like small change, from the heroic to the kind of quotidian, okay, of, now, what's at play here? Well, at the most evident level, there's a political agenda, which I suppose any elected party would indulge in, not least one in those circumstances of 1994. It's about, clearly the quote from Tocqueville says, the elections and all that preceded it unleashed popular protagonism, popular activism. We only got there because of popular struggles of one kind or another. And we even unleashed people, millions and millions, to vote for us as the ANC, and they also voted for other parties as well, of course, in elections. But now somehow we've got to put the genie back into the bottle, because we're now in charge, and our responsibility is to deliver. Okay. So what we're seeing here is the sort of things that political parties do, I guess, when they change from being an opposition, or in this case a liberation movement, into an incumbent government. But it's also moving then into, and here it starts to become, I don't know if it would be right to say hermeneutic capture or whatever, but of a particular understanding of what is required and what needs to be done. It's preparing the grounds for basically a top-down redistributive state. And I want to hold on to the term because I'm going to play around with it quite a bit, redistribution. Now, there's a political agenda which is easily recognizable, not least in retrospect, but even at the time, many of us recognized it. But what permits it discursively, what allows it is, in part, the notion is a separation from the idea of equality from liberty. For instance, that front cover that I show you, which proclaims free at last, doesn't proclaim equal at last. Why? Well, because it would have been totally implausible, I would guess, to proclaim equal at last. So even if you go back to the photos at the beginning, those long queues of people queuing in the sun, whites and blacks were subjected to long queues, but that's a black queue, okay, in a township. I think it's one of the Gauteng townships. So those queues were much longer, and you notice there were some buses standing about. They had to get there, not in private cars, but in buses and so forth. So, but there was equality. There was a degree of equality that had happened. For the first time ever, all adult South Africans were equal voters. One vote counted equally with every other vote. So there was an advance in equality. And there was an advance in freedom, but both were partial advances. But so why do you proclaim free at last and then start to deny it in the next passage? But have some plausibility of claiming free at last, but where saying equal at last would really have just fallen very flat. And that then takes me to I'm going to borrow philosophers very eclectically. In this case, it's Etienne Balibar that I'm going to quote, and from his fairly recent book called Equilibrity. It's a awkward word, but it's making the point that he fundamentally wants to make. And he says that although they are distinct concepts, they, in practice, are inseparable. And you can't realize the one without the other. And I think logicians will tell me that that's it's an elenchus, if I remember my 1960s and 70s training. But anyway, if I'm wrong, forgive me. But that's the argument, that fundamentally, a tradition that goes back, Balibar argues to the Enlightenment, draws a dichotomy between equality and liberty. Okay. And that has a deep kind of discursive or ideological power on the way in which we think about things. So liberty tends to be thought of as a moment, precisely, an event. Okay. And that's where I think that the notion of capabilities theory, and Balibar interestingly quotes it, he's not quite into that theory, starts to make the linkages. Liberty is not about getting the monkey off our back. Yes, it's part of that. It's getting the apartheid regime off our back. So in a sense, we're kind of free, although they might have gone in judicial, legal, and later constitutional terms. But of course, apartheid still is alive and well in South Africa in many, many respects. But part of it has gone, and we're kind of free, somewhat free. as South Africans. And we're equal, somewhat equal. So what the editorial should have said of Maiboi was, you know, this democratic breakthrough and the inauguration of a new president have brought elements of greater freedom and elements of greater equality, if it wanted to use those words, more capacity to South Africans, but a long road to travel. Okay, it doesn't do that. It celebrates an event, a moment, and hypes it up terribly, and then drops it off the cliff, as it were. And Balibar, usefully for me anyhow, suggests that this has to do with, the Enlightenment notion of a distinction between equality and liberty, and then he traces it through, and I've tried to do it in a sort of tabled form, so that equality is essentially seen as an economic or social construct, whereas liberty is a natural birthright. The equality requires redistributive state intervention, not necessarily just state, but overwhelmingly state redistribution. And that's what the editorial was doing, was saying, okay, now thanks very much for the struggle, but our luta discontinues, the struggle discontinues. We will now deliver as a redistributive state. Liberty is seen as a protection of individuals from state intervention. Tendency, obviously, it's strongly marked in liberal versions of liberty. Equality is part of public endeavor. Liberty belongs in a private sphere. So equality is seen as the rights of the citizen, whereas liberty is more a natural right, anterior, even having an ontological, higher, earlier status than citizenship. Okay. And all of those in Balibar and in my view are problematic, but I think it's that schema that helps to inform and give the apparent meaningfulness to the cover of Maiboi, Free at Last. Okay, now, having, and I've taken the Maiboi cover, but one could use lots of other discursive elements from South Africa, not least at that time and later, and I will be picking up a few other speeches or texts of one kind or another to try to illustrate further points. So, having separated these notions, and the notion that freedom is some kind of event, natural right, it's a state, if you like, not a process. Whereas equality is a process of redistribution and a set of interventions. It tries to then think, or discussion and discourse, whether in legislation or policy documents in South Africa or in the public debate and so forth. Basically, the attempt is then to give freedom substantive content by reconnecting it with equality by way of imagining redistribution as some kind of return to some anterior state of harmony. Okay. But the nature, as I want to go on to argue, of the direction of this return is entirely ambivalent, and something I'll try to illustrate. So is it a return to some pre-colonial or pre-apartheid period of greater harmony, naturalness, or whatever? Some kind of restitution of a past that's been dispossessed. Now, it would be surprising if there was not that strong feeling in a country that had experienced terrible racial, colonial, national oppression, and a sense that our dignity has been lost, our place names have been lost. Freedom and equality is about recovering those things. And I don't want to be dismissive of that notion, but I think it easily misleads us as well if we think that freedom and equality lie in the direction of a more or less simple return. But then, quite interestingly, and often in the same texts, return has a very different meaning. It's a kind of return to normality, some kind of global universalizing modernity after 40 regrettable years of apartheid taking us away from the world in which we live. We've lost out. We're no longer part of the progressive edge of things. But we must return to modernity, to universality. So what I should have pointed out is that I've called the first return Maiboi because that's, interestingly, that's the title of the ANC magazine that I was quoting from, but it means let it come back. Maiboi Africa, come back Africa. So the resonance of a notion of return to something that was more harmonious, more dignified, better in all kinds of ways is very deeply marked, okay, in discourse and for many obvious reasons. But then there's the second notion of a return to universality, that apartheid was somehow exceptional in one kind or another, but we've abolished it and now we can return back to the family of nations. Okay. And then there's a third version which is increasingly has a resonance 20 years after the 1994 democratic breakthrough. And that's a kind of nostalgia for 1994, if you like. A return to the rainbowism, a return to when South Africa was a poster boy of the world. We did good things. And somehow we've lost it along the way in these last 20 years. Bad ANC government, corrupt government, and lots of reasons to think that, unfortunately. And Sakela Bukhulungu talked about the Marikana massacre, which happened 2 years ago tomorrow. So all kinds, the promise of 1994, in many people's views, has been lost, has been compromised, has been betrayed in all kinds of ways. And so often there's a nostalgia to return to that moment. But these things are all often in the same discourse, muddled up, okay, and held together as it were through the notion of liberty and equality equals some kind of return. I just want to note in passing that linked into this is a whole lot of rewords in South African discourse, and South Africans will recognize it. So there's land restitution. There's national reconciliation, notably in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Let me immediately say, I think that the TRC, for instance, was a brilliant and wonderful intervention. Maybe, Miranda, I can come and study under you and look at the TRC as a really interesting public example of empowering testimonial capacity, and contributing to a significant epistemic shift. I think of my father-in-law, who was in denial about the horrors of apartheid. I can't believe it didn't happen. But that TRC, which was held in community town halls and churches in the most remote places of South Africa, went on for 1.5, 2 years, and ordinary citizens for the first time came forward and told their stories, often sharing their stories with the white part of the town, and finding that the stories were overlapping to some extent and they had different perspectives. And so it's a brilliant example. So that's why when at the break I said, yes, someone suggested that you should focus on the individual and not too much on the social, but also look, please, at the social dimensions. I think it was a brilliant. But okay, reconciliation, truth and reconciliation, reconstruction and development program, restorative justice, moral regeneration, African renaissance, and even the return of South Africa to a supposedly happy family of nations. Now, many of the things here have some sense, have some reality, and have, there's much to understand in them. But they all, let's take Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It suggests that South Africa was conciled somewhere, and now let's have a truth-telling testimonial process, and we will reconcile. So it's a kind of return to a previous harmony, rather than the construction of conciliation. Okay, so they're different notions, and all of these rewords tend to pull us into a direction which I think has hampered an understanding of what it is that we're trying to do and how to achieve social justice. Okay. Now, let me then just run through the three different returns that I've highlighted. The one is what I'm calling Maiboi return. It's a return to, what is it a return to? Is it a return to pre-17th century? Colonialism really hit the ground running from the mid-17th century in South Africa, right here in Cape Town. Or is it a return to perhaps 1910, when we had the first internal, as it were, white minority regime, or 1913, when the Land Acts started to come in, which dispossessed people formally? Or is it a return to pre-1948, when apartheid became the official thing? And the moment you try to to do that, and the area, and I think that Amanda Gous will be talking, perhaps touching a little bit on this when she deals with the traditional courts, bills, and sets of legislation. What do you mean by tradition? When you try to return back to some pre-period, pre-apartheid perhaps, or pre-colonialism, you run into a whole tangled history if you're dealing with land reform and land restitution, a whole tangled history of occupation, reoccupation, and so on. Some of it was not white colonialism. Some of it was, inter-ethnic and so on. I say that very guardedly, not to underrate the massive complicity and guilt of white colonial and later apartheid segregationist policies. I mean, that's been the most dramatic injustice in our country. But nonetheless, so I won't dwell on this, but just to say that I think those familiar in South Africa will know that there's a whole muddle now and inability to actually implement effective land reform and land restitution in our country. There's all kinds of claims on what tradition is. Amanda Gous will be talking about that. Mahmoud Mandani has a lovely phrase which I quote there. He says that often what is called tradition in South Africa is not the force of tradition, but the perpetuation of the tradition of force. Because colonial regimes and the apartheid regime used patriarchy in the reserves and so on as a significant control mechanism and dressed it up as tradition and built into it elements of tradition. But this return notion when it comes to land reform and land restitution runs into the reality that the great majority of South Africans are now urbanized, over 60% and soon to be 70%. And so very interestingly, when we try to implement land reform and land restitution, the majority of beneficiaries go for cash rather than the actual land, because they don't want to go back to that. They're living somewhere else. But they do want, and correctly so, want some kind of reparation for what they've lost. Okay. But critically, and this almost is my fulcrum point, and maybe this is where I run into lots of trouble with Rawlsian and other philosophers, is I think there's a problem with the notion that justice or equality is about redistribution. Now, I know one can use any of these words, including redistribution, in any number of ways. So there's not necessarily, the signifier doesn't have to dominate the signified or whatever. But the tendency, therefore, is to imagine that, is to ignore, in the case of land reform, the productive economy. Okay, so we will redistribute things in order to produce a return, greater equality, greater justice, and so on. And I don't, again, want to be misunderstood, that redistribution is definitely about, redistribution is definitely a component of ensuring greater social equality and so on. But if you confine it to a redistributive thing, you start to forget something else, which is the way in which the productive economy, in this case the landed productive economy, has moved along and is quite different and is reproducing actively and dynamically all of the inequalities. And I want to deal with that a little bit more as we proceed. Okay. So a second kind of return, which is often heard, a little bit less now, thanks to the global financial crisis and I think the puncturing the balloon of globalization and its many claims and so forth. But certainly after 1994 and through the better part of a decade, the idea was that the South African breakthrough, the ending of apartheid, meant that we could return to universality. There'd been a detour, that apartheid was some kind of exceptionalism, global exceptionalism. Have a look at Archbishop Tutu's wonderful but problematic prefatory remarks to the TRC report. And basically what it says is that the Nazism was abolished in the mid-1940s. Communism has unraveled in the late 80s and early 90s. It has, I agree. And deserved to, given what it was. Although I still consider myself a communist, but not that kind of communist. And now apartheid, says Archbishop Tutu, has been abolished. So now the world is at one. We're into a sphere of universality, of common values, and so forth. Okay. So again, if we just map it on, there's the public sector, private sector, civil society. The public sector, the state, has redistributive responsibilities, and the private sector is the engine of growth. It's the place where things are productive. The state consumes. It needs to sometimes consume in order to redistribute. It needs to expend, but where value is created is in the private sector, okay? And the state has a regulatory, which is part of its redistributive role, whereas the free market is also about globalization. Okay, so let me move to my next quote from President Mandela himself. And this is his last State of Nation address as president of the country to Parliament in February of 1999. And, you know, with many good reasons, he looked over with great pride and personal pride, as he deserved to, because he played such a central role, with considerable satisfaction over the preceding 5 years since the democratic breakthrough of '94, now nearly 5 years later in Parliament. And so he says, for a country that not many years ago was the polecat of the world, South Africa has truly undergone a revolution in its relations with the international community. The doors of the world have opened to South Africa precisely because of our success in achieving things that humanity as a whole holds dear. Okay, and I've put in bold a couple of phrases, which are, so there's a lot of relevance in that. South Africa had been, the apartheid regime, to be more correct, had been excluded from, there had been economic sanctions, cultural sanctions, boycotts, sports boycotts, and so on. So there's a sense of a return, of an opening up, and so on. So it's not without validity, but just dwell on a couple of the highlighted phrases there. So not many years ago, South Africa, or us as a country, were the polecat of the world. Now hang on. Mandela's ANC campaigned from its very formation in 1912 to protest against the injustices of, you know, white minority rule, and from the 70s, 60s and 70s and 80s had campaigned for the isolation of the apartheid regime and tried to portray it as the polecat, precisely, as one of the polecats, as a crime against humanity. So suddenly we're taking on collectively the guilt and the isolation of the apartheid regime of white minority rule. And because we've done that, and this is all part of the reconciliation aspect, so, you know, generously, I mean, Mandela himself, by the way, apparently until about 3 years ago, was still listed but not treated as a terrorist in the United States. So in the capitals of Western democracy, until very late in the day, the ANC and its allied formations were treated as, you know, bad, as terrorist organizations. So there's a funny flipping going on here. Something interesting is happening. Doors of the world have opened to us because of our success, collective, not people struggling against a bad regime, that humanity holds, as a whole, holds dear. So this notion that there are universal values, and after being a bit of a polecat or prodigal for a while, we've now returned back to the bosom of the world community. Okay. Now, what are these things that the world as a whole holds dear that Mandela is referring to? And I'll go on to suggest two things, basically. The one would be that we're now applying good economic policies, okay? The kind of Washington consensus. We're part of a global consensus, which equals Washington consensus. But secondly, also, it's about, we have brought about a liberal democracy, okay? And I'll park those for the moment, but want to come back to them. Okay, but before I get there, let me introduce my next philosopher, who's really a geographer, but who's a philosopher, like all good geographers, Doreen Massey, okay? And she makes some interesting points about these words that we use very frequently, developed and developing, okay? And what she says, this is from an interview, she says that when you talk about the difference, what are simultaneous difference in space between, an example she uses, I haven't got the full quote here, Argentina and the UK, north and south. When we talk about the one as developing and the other as developed, what we're doing is we're turning simultaneous difference into a narrative or into time, into history. So Argentina isn't yet UK, but it's developing, i.e. it's moving towards being developed. Okay. And what that does, she says correctly, is that she says it categorically, I'd nuance it perhaps a little bit, it tends for you to think that there is only one possibility, basically. You're okay, Argentina or South Africa, because you're developing, but there's a single ladder along which you develop. There's a single route. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about the apartheid is, of course, it took space extremely seriously. And unlike the example that at the superficial level, unlike the example that Doreen Massey is using, it asserted, catalogued, entrenched, and policed spatial separation, simultaneous racialized difference and spatial separation. But it also introduced the notion of development. So in order to justify what it was doing, so apartheid, by the way, was a word that we didn't use against it. They used it themselves proudly. This is our policy. It's about separation, racial separation. But it's okay because it's separate development. It's not that these guys over there are not developed. They're just in a different racial time, okay, but they will develop too, and that's what we're wanting to do. But if we just merge them, they're never going to develop. I mean, basically was the argument. Okay, so we'll keep them apart, but ensure that, put them on the road also to the UK or to whatever, Sandton or Rondebosch or whatever. Okay, now let's come back to the notion of productive economy. And I'm not going to have enough time really to clinch the argument, but just to flag it a little bit. You see, what it masked in the South African case, and perhaps this is the big difference between Gaza, the terrible, horrendous things that are happening there, and the South African reality. We correctly say that, in my view, Zionist Israel is an apartheid state and so on. But the critical difference in South Africa, one of the critical differences, is apart from the size of things, Israel and Palestine, and occupied Palestine are much smaller, is that the racial separation or exclusion of the majority of South Africans was never a complete exclusion. It was an exclusion and a simultaneous inferior inclusion. And to understand that best, it's useful to just map very schematically the history of South Africa. South Africa only comes into being in 1910 as a formal, legal, constitutional entity. Not very constitutional, but you know what I mean. It's the mining revolution that that carves out the space that we call South Africa. And mines in South Africa, forgive me for going a little bit way from philosophy, but okay, maybe it's not, I don't know. Plato talks about people down mines. Oh no, there's a speculation that the shadows and things like that had to do with, okay. So hold up the thing, okay. I'm getting a bit rusty, but okay. Mining. The mining in South Africa was deep in the hinterland and not near a port, so that meant you needed a country with logistics lines and so on that come to colonial ports to take the stuff out. It meant, but also South Africa was and remains very, very rich in mineral wealth, but the minerals are quite difficult to mine. They're quite deep, quite quickly. And so it required industrial mining on a very large scale. So huge flows of foreign direct investment to make it possible, but also it's horrible work. So you needed both highly capitalized enterprises as well as a huge mass of so-called cheap labor. How to get the cheap labor? Well, you squeeze the native reserves, put taxes on them so that they're forced to come out of those reserves. In any case, they are, because they're more and more squeezed, and sustainable livelihoods are more and more impossible. Squeeze them, tax them, so they've got to find cash from somewhere, and lo and behold, out they pop, and they come in their tens of thousands every year as migrant laborers. So you get this articulation deeply embedded in the productive character of South Africa's economy, which remains the case still today, of exclusion, racial basically, and then the inferior inclusion within the system as migrant workers. The apartheid regime really just built on the foundations of the system, but at a time when this system was in crisis. Basically, the so-called native reserves, which they then called Bantustans, had become so squeezed that the ability of these Bantustans to reproduce an army of laborers, basically cheaply, because the mining houses didn't carry the cost of reproduction. The rearing of children, the caring for the sick and for the old, all of those, what we would call social redistributive measures, were plonked onto these labor reserves, basically Bantustans. So the labor was, under duress, under all kinds of domination, but at the same time was cheapened further by the fact that the reproduction of large numbers of people desperate to get some kind of cash income, and so on. So the way in which the economy... Okay, now that system became more and more unsustainable by the 1940s. And the apartheid regime didn't invent things. Basically, it responded intelligently from their perspective to the crisis of the system. So they did their best to assist the kind of survivalist possibilities in the Bantustans, but at the same time realized there'd been significant urbanization of black people. And so what apartheid was then about was create reserves, if you like, or dormitory townships on the outskirts of your industrial and economic and political hubs. And that's the pattern of South Africa's spatial reality still today. These deep rural areas, which remain labor-centric areas on the one hand, but increasingly daily migrancy from displaced semi-peripheral townships. Okay, so I went on a little bit, but it's in order to make the point, critical point that I'm wanting to make is that the productive system of South Africa, it locks us into the reproduction of poverty, inequality, and racial injustice of all kinds. The spatial organization, for instance, of the productive system in South Africa has these features. And so what the redistribution state, of which I'm part, does is it's been redistributing quite significantly since 1994. 3 million free houses, basically, for the poorest of the poor. Not all of them, because the queue is endless. 16 million social grants. So there's redistribution, but the redistribution is going into a spatial reality and other realities that reproduce all of these problems. So it's a bit like, the escalator's coming down and we're sprinting up, but the escalator just keeps grinding along and reproducing the problems. And so the redistributive functions, which are critical and very important, and it's some kind of survival for people. And when we go to elections as an ANC, we say there's a good news story to tell, and we talk about all of those noble efforts at 16 million social grants, so many 3 million free houses for poor people. But they're in the same distant locations, same faraway places, dormitory townships for daily migrancy. Okay. Okay, now the same, maybe I can't complete this, I'm sure I'm running out of time and so on, but the same applies, the same spatial configuration, so to speak, roughly, applies in the relationship between South Africa and the global economy of which it's part, and of which it's been part probably since colonialism in the late mid-17th century, but certainly from the 19th century onwards with the mining revolution. So there's also a core and periphery relationship in the way in which South Africa, a so-called developing country, relates to the world. Essentially, what do? We remain still hugely locked into unbeneficiated mineral exports as a country. Okay, so we export iron ore out as dirt from Saldanha up the road to Japan, China, and so forth. We export manganese, we export coal, and then we buy them back, as cell phones and as computers and so on. High value goods. So we create high skilled jobs out there, wealthy economies out there, or relatively wealthy economies, while we get locked still into this vicious cycle, this articulation of being not developing but constantly underdeveloped by the way in which we are hooked into and integrated into the global economy. So when Mandela says the doors of the world have opened to South Africa because of our success and so on, he's partly talking to the fact that no longer are there trade sanctions against South Africa, investment sanctions and so on. But the open doors have resulted overwhelmingly, as many economists have shown, to the stuff going out and not the Marshall aid that we thought would come in because we were doing something that the world holds dear, and so on. Okay. Let me move on. Okay. Now, linked to that then, and I'm finally coming to my title, okay, although in the course of writing the thing, you can see that there are lots of liberties and all kinds of things happened, okay. The notion of how to develop is very often linked into the notion of growth. And as South Africa, you just open any newspaper in South Africa, you'll see there's a crisis, our GDP is very low, we're not competing effectively with comparator countries and so forth. And so here are some more texts. The South African National Development Plan of 2012, so it's a more recent document, says, only by reducing poverty and inequality through broadening opportunity, okay, that sounds a little bit like Amartya Sen, but not quite, can the country achieve real unity. The country has much more to gain if a win-lose debate, we get rid of that, that's bad, and shift into a win-win debate, focusing simultaneously on growing the cake and redistributing it. The official opposition party says much the same thing, the Democratic Alliance. If we are to open up opportunities for all and create a prosperous, inclusive, and presumably more equal society, the pie needs to get bigger so that there's more to share. Okay, so we're back again with this dichotomy between production, basically let's leave that to the engine of growth, private sector, capitalist investment and so on, open doors, liberalization and so on. That will grow the pie, and then the state basically will have more pie to share out, and so we can achieve greater equality. Okay. Now, what is meant in these documents and much other public discourse by growth is, as we know, tends to be gross domestic product, which is very gross indeed, by the way. And interestingly, there's a significant, and I think across a broad range of different ideological persuasions, a growing critique of the notion of GDP as some kind of useful and accurate metric of what is useful, what is just, what is even economic. Okay. Basically, it measures the quantity of traded goods and services and not the quality. So money spent on gambling and money spent on healthcare or high tuition, I'm not sure if that fits into gambling or high, okay, I'm getting polemical, are measured equally as contributing to the GDP, regardless of whether it's gambling or something else like healthcare. Traffic congestion, it's wonderful. It actually increases GDP because the more petrol you consume stuck in congestion on the N2, N1, that's contributing brilliantly. It's ticking up our GDP. So remain stuck, let's have more congestion in order to increase the GDP. Financial services add to GDP, whether allocating capital to productive investment and useful things, bricks and mortar, factories and so on that create jobs, or fueling speculative bubbles, and more that's what they're doing. Mining, to take the South African very central example, it depletes non-renewable resources, but it's counted positively. So every ton of unbeneficiated iron ore that we ship out of Saldanha from the Northern Cape, that's great, it goes and it gets ticked. It's not high value. It would be better if we were shipping out cell phones or something like that. We bring them back in. But anyhow, that all counts as GDP. But voluntary, unpaid work, a good feminist argument that's been around for a long time, reproductive work that women do, not counted, non-traded activities, particularly serious in third world countries where a huge amount of the actual economy is not traded. It's in the so-called informal or formalized economy, and so all of that is past, is not within the vision and scope of what gets measured as part of GDP. So you remove things, you remove your iron ore and it's gone. Doesn't grow again. But that's good, it counts as GDP. You use your natural resources sustainably, and depending on how much they trade for, it's the equivalent or maybe less than things. In the particular deployment, political deployment I'm currently in, it's a big issue, this. I'm in the Department of Public Works, and we've got a really brilliant, I think, public works program in South Africa, which includes a whole range of sectors and so on. One of them is in the area of the environmental sector, and there's a brilliant program called Working for Water, in which people basically on small stipends of 71 Rand a day are trained and then work to clear invasive aliens. And the figure there I quote is that something like 400 billion rands worth of water in a water scarce country has been saved. 2 million hectares of grazing territory, 71% has been rescued from irreparable damage and so on. That doesn't count. What does count in the GDP is the 71 Rand we pay to the participants. But it's seen as expenditure, so it's not really sustainable. It's the state using a small pie and then doling it out into public works programs and so on, digging holes, filling them up again and so on. So the battle over what we mean by growth, for instance, what we value and why we value it, is a big battle. And unfortunately, part of the discourse in South Africa in trying to move from 1994 to greater social justice, equality, and so forth, is compromised by the notion that we must just grow the pie, and the measurement of a growing pie is GDP. Hugely problematic. So yet another concept that has an epistemic, if I'm using the word rightly, domination, and disqualifies other views and perspectives. Okay, now the last point, sorry, time. Okay, sorry. Okay, I want then to touch on the political, if you like, as opposed to moving from the economic to the political. So when, as I said earlier, Mandela said, because of our success in achieving things, doing things that the world holds dear, the doors of the world have opened to us. Partly it's the Washington Consensus that we're implementing, and that's good, and we're no longer a pariah. But what he also meant was, I believe, that we've instituted a liberal democracy. And that theme, in my view, is also picked up in the National Development Plan when it says that in order to grow the pie or the cake, we must move away from a win-lose debate to a win-win debate, focusing simultaneously on growing the cake and redistributing it. Now, what's meant by this, is, and this is where the notion of, I can see a 5-minute warning, or probably less than that, redistributive injustice. Yes, now I can make it. I think that as South Africans we're battling, and certainly as the ANC, of which I'm part, we're battling with what we understand by a democracy. And that's perhaps not unrelated to the fact that the time at which we broke through into a non-racial democracy was a time at which the end of history was being proclaimed, that there was only one way of doing things. Fukuyama, of course, was famous for saying, all isms are now what, he didn't say that, but someone else said, all isms have now become wasms. We're now living in a technically neutral managerialist space, which fits in nicely also with the government self-conception as a redistributive state. Aluta discontinua, the struggle discontinues. We will do it managerially, technocratically, and so on. We'll distribute, demobilize, and redistribute. And therefore, politics becomes, as it were, elite pacting. And what Chantal Mouffe says, and I'm not really going to have time, given the now 2.5 minutes, to really clinch the argument, but it's in the paper. There's some brilliant stuff, and I really hope that what she's saying comes into the South African public discourse, which is that we must defend pluralist democratic politics. It's the great achievement, one of the great achievements of 1994. But we understand what we mean by that. A democracy doesn't abolish difference and even deep antagonism, but it manages those antagonisms in a way that contains them. In other words, what she says nicely is you transform erstwhile enemies into constitutional opponents. Now, liberation movements, of which I'm part, have great and maybe communist parties even more so, have great difficulty in getting that. If you're not with us, you're the enemy. So there's a problem from our side. But then there's also the other problem of encouraging us from a kind of liberal perspective, that politics is about elite pacting, striking deals amongst an elite, because really politics is now just getting the technocratics, the technicalities of politics right. Okay. Now, okay, I have to jump that. What I go on to argue in the paper is that the National Development Plan, very interestingly, 2 minutes, you've been very kind. I know it's like stretching too much.
That's 2 questions that we can wrap up.
Okay. There's a slight slipperiness in the National Development Plan, very nice plan, nice good things and so on. But overwhelmingly, what it does is it slides between the notion of a social, it defines at the end as the way forward. It defines the way forward as some kind of social contracting. And it says social contracts are basically among individuals. Then it says or between individuals or citizens and government. Now that or and its status is ambivalent, but they're two different forms of contract. And if you like, you could say the first contract, if you want to use those words, happened in April 1994 in South Africa, when millions of South Africans came out as individuals and voted. Some voted wisely for the ANC, some voted for other parties, but they all, overwhelmingly 95% white and black, voted. So that was a kind of social contract version 1. Social contract version 2 was, the product of that was not just a new National Assembly, but also an elected Democratic Constituent Assembly, which in 1996 developed a constitution. And that constitution basically is a version 2 social contract, which is rights and duties of citizens, rights and responsibilities and duties of the state, a kind of contractual arrangement, if you want to call it that. Okay. But then it slides from those definitions to a different version of social contract, pretending that this is another return, back to the lovely rainbowism of 1994. What we must do is get back to that spirit. What we must have is another social contract. But that social contract becomes an elite pact, a stakeholders agreement on growing the cake. So it must be a contract between the workers and business. Government will, as it were, umpire that a little bit, but then benefit in terms of its redistributive functions because the cake will be grown. And there's a whole, so it's a false return, okay, to 1994, but using that slippery notion of social contract, which we're all familiar with as philosophers, as the alibi for carrying out this contract. So, can't finish. I wanted to end with a ringing manifesto about what to do about all of these problems, but inspired by Miranda, I began with all of the negatives and never ended except with the negatives, but hopefully understanding the negatives helps us to understand also what has to be done. Thanks very much, and sorry about stretching the time.